While the Rothschilds had conquered Europe, a vast new empire was rising across the Atlantic. America, with its explosive growth and insatiable hunger for capital, represented the ultimate prize. But the Rothschilds faced a problem. Americans were deeply suspicious of foreign banking control. They needed an American face. They needed a family they could trust to execute their vision on new soil. They found that family in the Morgans. This is the story of how European banking royalty planted their flag in American territory, transforming a nation and creating the most powerful banker America has ever known. This is the story of J.P. Morgan, the man who would become the visible hand of invisible power. The year was 1837, when John Pierpont Morgan was born in Hartford, Connecticut. But to understand John's story, we must first understand his father, Junius Spencer Morgan, the man who would forge the critical link between the Rothschild Empire and American soil. Junius Morgan wasn't born into wealth. He came from respectable but modest circumstances, working his way up through Boston's merchant houses. He possessed sharp intelligence, impeccable judgment, and something rarer still, an understanding that true power in 19th century finance flowed from London, not Boston or New York. While other American merchants focused on domestic trade, Junius recognized that whoever controlled the flow of European capital into America would control America's future. In 1854, Junius made the pivotal decision that would alter his family's destiny. He accepted a partnership at George Peabody and Company in London. On the surface, this seemed like a straightforward career move. George Peabody was a respected American banker who had established himself in London as a facilitator of transatlantic commerce. American companies needed European capital to finance their expansion, and Peabody's firm served as the bridge. But there was something Junius understood that most others didn't. George Peabody didn't really work for American clients. He worked for the Rothschilds. Peabody's entire operation existed to channel Rothschild capital into American enterprises while maintaining the fiction that this was American-controlled investment. The Rothschilds had learned from their European experience that overt foreign control generated resentment and political backlash. Far better to operate through respected local intermediaries who could present Rothschild interests as domestic investment. When Junius joined Peabody's firm, he wasn't just getting a job, he was being evaluated. The Rothschilds needed to know if this ambitious American possessed the intelligence, discretion, and loyalty required to serve as their primary American agent. Junius spent a decade proving himself. He learned the Rothschild method: how to structure deals that generated multiple profit streams, how to use information advantages to dominate markets, and how to coordinate actions across international borders while maintaining absolute secrecy about the true source of capital and control. By the time George Peabody retired in 1864, there was no question who would succeed him. Junius took control of the firm, renaming it J.S. Morgan and Company. On paper, this was an independent American banking house in London. In reality, it was a Rothschild satellite operation designed specifically to funnel European capital into American opportunities while providing the Rothschilds with intelligence about American political and economic developments. The arrangement was perfect. The Rothschilds provided unlimited access to capital. Junius provided American expertise and connections. Together, they would finance America's transformation from an agricultural republic into an industrial superpower, profiting enormously from that transformation while ensuring that European banking interests maintained influence over American development. But Junius faced a problem. He was building this empire from London, thousands of miles from the American opportunities he needed to exploit. He needed someone he could trust absolutely to represent Morgan interests in America. Someone who shared his vision. Someone who could be trained from childhood to understand and execute the Rothschild method. He needed his son. Young John Pierpont Morgan grew up in a world most Americans never saw. While other children played with toys, John absorbed the intricate mechanics of international finance. His childhood illnesses, those brutal coughing fits and debilitating migraines, kept him confined indoors for extended periods. But this apparent misfortune became an advantage. While bedridden, John studied financial statements and correspondence from his father's firm. He learned early that money flowed in channels invisible to ordinary people, that real power operated quietly through relationships and information advantages rather than public displays of force. When rheumatic fever struck with particular severity, Junius made the controversial decision to send his son alone to the Azore Islands for nearly a year. Some historians have interpreted this as a father's desperate attempt to cure his son's illness. But consider the timing and the lesson it taught. John was isolated, forced to rely entirely on himself, separated from everything comfortable and familiar. He learned self-reliance, yes, but he also learned something more important. He learned what it meant to be alone with responsibility, to make decisions without immediate support, to trust his own judgment even when isolated. These were precisely the qualities Junius would need in his American representative. Someone who could operate independently in New York while remaining loyal to the larger vision being coordinated from London. By 1857, John was ready to begin his real education. At 20 years old, he arrived in New York to take a position at Duncan, Sherman and Company, the banking firm that handled George Peabody and Company's American interests. This wasn't a random first job. This was John being inserted into the American end of the Rothschild pipeline. His official responsibilities seemed straightforward: facilitating American transactions for Peabody's London house, handling correspondence, managing relationships with American clients. But his real education was in understanding how the system actually worked, how European capital flowed into American railroad bonds and government securities, how information from America about political developments, crop failures, or business opportunities could be transmitted to London, giving Rothschild-backed investors crucial advantages over competitors. John proved to be an exceptional student. He possessed his father's analytical intelligence, but combined it with something Junius lacked: a ruthless decisiveness, a willingness to act boldly when he identified an opportunity. This trait manifested dramatically in 1859, when John, on a business trip to New Orleans, used company money to purchase an entire shipment of Brazilian coffee that had arrived in port without a buyer. The senior partners at his firm were outraged. This appeared to be reckless speculation with company capital. But consider what John actually accomplished. He identified a commodity opportunity where supply temporarily exceeded demand. He moved decisively with borrowed capital to acquire the entire supply. He then controlled the market, selling at a substantial profit. This wasn't recklessness. This was the Rothschild method executed perfectly. In 1861, John made his move toward independence. At 24, he left Duncan, Sherman and Company to establish his own firm, J.P. Morgan and Company. On the surface, this appeared to be a young man striking out on his own. In reality, it was the next phase of a carefully orchestrated plan. John's firm would maintain an exclusive relationship with his father's London house, which was itself effectively operating as a Rothschild proxy. Now the structure was complete and perfectly designed for plausible deniability. The Rothschilds would provide capital through their various European houses. That capital would flow to Junius Morgan's London firm. Junius would channel it to John's New York firm. John would invest it in American railroads, government bonds, and industrial enterprises. The profits would flow back through the same channels, enriching all parties while maintaining the fiction that this was purely American enterprise. Then came the Civil War, and with it, one of the most revealing episodes in understanding the Morgan-Rothschild philosophy. When the 1863 Conscription Act should have required John to serve in the Union Army, he paid $300 for a substitute to fight in his place. This decision has been criticized by historians as unpatriotic, but such criticism misses the point entirely. John wasn't thinking as an American patriot, he was thinking as a Rothschild agent. The Rothschilds had spent a century financing European wars. They had learned that patriotism was a sentiment for common soldiers, not for bankers. Wars represented business opportunities, nothing more. The question wasn't which side deserved to win. The question was which side would win, and how could banking interests profit from that outcome? John's infamous rifle transaction exemplified this philosophy perfectly. Surplus Hall carbine rifles, deemed too obsolete for military use, were available from the government at $3.50 each. A consortium purchased 5,000 of these weapons, made minor modifications, then immediately resold them to the government for $22 each, a 600% markup. The profit was substantial. The optics were terrible. This was war profiteering at its most brazen. Public outrage was predictable and fierce. But for John, this wasn't about patriotism. This was about executing the Rothschild method. Identify market inefficiencies, exploit information advantages, extract maximum profit. The real significance of the Civil War, however, was the massive government debt it created. The Union government needed to finance an enormously expensive military campaign. This required issuing unprecedented amounts of government bonds. And who purchased many of those bonds? European banking houses, including Junius Morgan's London firm, backed by Rothschild capital. Think about what this meant. The Rothschilds, through their network of European proxies, including the Morgans, were literally financing the Union war effort. They were betting enormous sums that the industrialized North would defeat the agricultural South. When the Union won, the Rothschilds and their proxies won. The bonds they had purchased at war prices became extremely valuable. After the war, America faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding and expanding. The Transcontinental Railroad needed completion. Industrial infrastructure required massive investment. All of this required capital on a scale that simply did not exist within America. The country needed European money, which meant it needed the Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds needed their American representatives, the Morgans. In 1871, John made a strategic move that would define the rest of his career. He partnered with Anthony Drexel to form Drexel, Morgan and Company. Drexel brought American connections and social respectability. John brought something even more valuable: unlimited access to European capital through his father's London house, and through that house, access to Rothschild resources. The firm's strategy focused heavily on railroads. America's railroad system was fragmented and chaotic. Dozens of competing companies operated similar routes, constantly slashing prices. John looked at this and saw exactly what the Rothschilds had seen in European railroads: an opportunity for consolidation. The strategy was straightforward. use superior access to capital to acquire struggling railroads, merge them together, create regional monopolies, install professional management, extract monopoly profits. This strategy had a name: Morganization. But it could just as accurately have been called Rothschildization, because John was simply executing the same playbook the Rothschilds had perfected in Europe. John's advantage over his competitors was overwhelming. When other investors could not access sufficient capital, John could cable his father in London. Junius could draw on Rothschild resources. Within days, John would have millions that his competitors could not match. Over time, John accumulated control over roughly 1/3 of all American railroad track. Think about what this meant. The Rothschilds, through their Morgan proxy, now controlled transportation infrastructure essential to American commerce. They couldn't openly admit this control. That would generate political backlash. But the control was real, nonetheless. The panic of 1893 revealed just how completely the Rothschild-Morgan network had come to dominate American finance. The crisis triggered a cascade of bank failures. Foreign investors began redeeming American bonds for gold, depleting United States reserves. By 1895, those reserves had fallen to just $9 million. The United States government was on the verge of defaulting. President Cleveland understood this was a crisis that could destroy the nation. He needed someone who could mobilize enormous amounts of gold quickly. He needed J.P. Morgan. John understood this was an opportunity to demonstrate the indispensability of the Morgan-Rothschild network. But mobilizing the necessary gold would require Rothschild cooperation. For 3 decades, the Rothschilds had been systematically investing in gold mining operations. They controlled substantial gold inventories. John organized a syndicate to purchase $65 million in government bonds. The proceeds would purchase 3.5 million ounces of gold from European sources, primarily Rothschild-controlled operations. When Morgan announced the deal, the gold bonds sold out in 30 minutes. The crisis was averted. Morgan was hailed as the savior of American finance. But consider what had actually happened. At a moment of existential crisis, the United States government had been rescued by European capital, mobilized primarily through Rothschild channels arranged by the Morgans. In 1901, John executed his most famous transaction, purchasing Carnegie Steel for $480 million, then merging it with other companies to create U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. The scale raises an important question. Where did such enormous capital come from? When you trace the financing sources back, many connect to European capital markets and Rothschild-influenced banking houses. By the early 1900s, Morgan had become the most powerful banker in American history. But this power generated increasing concern. The Pujo Committee investigation of 1912 examined the money trust controlling American finance. The answers all pointed toward Morgan. The investigation led to the Federal Reserve System's creation in 1913. This is often presented as reform to protect Americans from concentrated banking power. But representatives of major banking houses, including Morgan interests, designed the Fed's structure. The Federal Reserve wasn't a defeat for the Morgan-Rothschild network. It was the system's evolution. Morgan died in 1913, just months after the Fed was created. His son Jack continued the firm, but the world was changing. World War I would transform America into the world's dominant economic power. The Rothschild strategy in America had succeeded brilliantly. They had helped finance America's rise through their Morgan proxies while remaining largely invisible. Today, J.P. Morgan Chase stands as America's largest bank with over $3 trillion in assets. The Rothschild banking empire continues operating quietly but influentially. They represent the enduring legacy of the transatlantic banking network that financed modern capitalism's rise. Understanding J.P. Morgan requires understanding the Rothschild connection. Morgan was the American manifestation of a European banking strategy, the visible face of invisible power. The Rothschilds had conquered Europe. Morgan became their conquest of America, their greatest creation. Together, they changed the world and established modern finance's architecture. The Morgan name became legendary. The Rothschild role remained in shadows. Power, after all, is most effective when invisible.